McQuestion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuestion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome. I'm Dennis McQuestion, and I'm sitting here with my co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Always good to be with you.
We get to talk about a subject called fraud today. What do you think?
I think it's something that we have to look a lot into because, as we've talked about offset just a little while ago, it has continued to get worse.
Unfortunately, you're right about that. So let me ask you, does it seem to you as if there's always a headline where some government employee or some corporate executive has committed fraud? And in the case of corporations, the shareholders have paid the price with huge fines. Well, on this program, Jim and I will examine what causes individuals and their employees to engage in fraudulent behavior, and most importantly, what can be done about it. Now, joining us via Skype from Italy, of all places, is journalist Tom Muller, who is the author of this book, Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. Tom, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dennis.
We'll be back to you in just a minute. I'm going to introduce someone you know very well here in the studio, and that's Marianne Jennings. And Marianne, you and I go back a long way, actually 17 years ago when you were first on our program. But for those people who don't remember you, you are Professor Emeritus of Legal and Ethical Studies at Arizona State University and the author of one of my favorite books called The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse. So wonderful stuff. What exactly is fraud and why are we talking about it? How big a problem is it today, after all?
Well, if I could bring us down from the fraud, because you almost want to have organ music after people say fraud. We tend to want to think, okay, it's corporations, it's that, but each of us has some accountability, some responsibility for this, because when we say something that is not quite true, you know, I always say to my students, how many of you have said that you had to work to get out of going to a party because you didn't want to go? How many of you have said that you were late to work because of traffic and that wasn't true at all? So that I think what you have to do is start to look at sort of the little patterns, because there's nobody in government or business who wakes up one day and says, fraud, this is the way I'm going to be successful. It's a gradual thing, and we actually know from the studies that as the brain accepts more and more little deviations, you'll take on more and more.
Well, isn't that where we are in society today, though? We seem to be not getting into politics at the moment, but we seem to be, shall we say, holding the truth in reserve in case we need it. Or am I missing something there?
Well, yeah, and you have people saying, well, I'll speak my truth here. You know, there's one truth, right, and we really have to focus on that. I had a philosophy professor back in the 70s, and first course in philosophy, and he came to class with what we would call high water pants, flood pants, and so you could see his socks every day with sandals, so that you get the picture. Right. And he gave us a lecture on truth, and he said one day, there is absolute truth. We may not know all of the information at the time, but there is truth. And he said, for example, how many pairs of socks do you think I have? And it was brilliant because we all had an opinion. Well, there's the white pair, the argyle. We were debating back and forth, and we said, how many do you have? And he said, I don't even know that, because I would have to check the laundry, I would have to check the drawers, I would have to do all of that. And so he issued us a caution and said, don't ever say something is absolute or say it unequivocally until you absolutely know. So it's all of these little things that kind of help us learn the lessons. You know, there's a road to fraud. It's you know, not always paved, but there is a road to fraud.
And where we are today, it's so hard for people to agree on what is a true fact, what is the fact.
Yes, and that's because usually they don't have full information. And I think what you have to start realizing is that we're all sort of at different levels in this. And if you think about that, you'll realize some of the little things that you are doing that could make a difference. Mm-hmm. So I brought along a graphic.
Okay, good.
To show you.
Let's look at that graphic, which I think is graphic number 2. So we'll look at your shades of compliance. Out of
Yes.
that. There it is.
And
right
so
there.
what you have to think about is that some of us are into variable compliance, which means sometimes we comply with the rules and sometimes we don't. And a good example this year was at Sloan Kettering, a premier cancer research, and their rule is if you're doing work for a pharmaceutical or receiving money from a pharmaceutical, you've got to disclose that. You have to file a form so that we know it's a conflict, so that we know. And a lot of research was published that was funded, and they discovered that one of the researchers had only filed forms on about half of that. And then some of the research could not be replicated. They were not getting the same results. So as a result of that, he left, whether fired or we don't know that part of it. But the CEO came out and said, we have not followed the rules all of the time. And that's fraud. When you say you are following the rules and you have not, that constitutes fraud. And we even saw it in the Navy, where what we had was a lot of accidents, and when they did the root cause, they discovered that in the rush to get people through the pipeline, the education and the training, they would sign off saying this individual had done it, but they didn't. So it's close enough. We're going to go ahead and do it. And one time, you'll be okay, but if you get a group of people together who have not been through the experiences, it can be chaotic. So that's variable compliance. Now let's go to the next one, which is the amoral technicians, interpretive compliance. This is kind of my favorite crowd. They've been around for a long time. They know the rules, but they just sort of push the envelope so that, you know, for example, just recently in the news, we had parents deciding that they would sign over their kids in a guardianship because that meant they were financially destitute and they could qualify for more loans and other kinds of things for college, so they didn't have to pay. And they have to close that loophole to do that. And then you have examples such as, I was reading the history of Britain in India. And when they got to New Delhi, there were cobras everywhere, just all over the place. And the government said, well, we can't have that. So they decided to offer a bounty for everybody who bought in dead cobras, that they would pay them to get rid of them. And it worked. They were bringing in cobras right and left, but what we found out is that they were breeding cobras. That's the money returned. So that what you have here are people say, well, show me where that's wrong. I want to know where I've made a mistake. And these are, in the accounting frauds, these are the interpretations, so that they'll push the envelope as far as they can. So accounting fraud doesn't begin with, well, let's just lie about the numbers. It begins with, okay, let's change the depreciation formula. And was there really anything? Well, you know, then you start down a path.
Well, and you remember, obviously, WorldCom, they were basically capitalizing expenses, and that's how
Yes.
they looked like they were making money, and of course their assets were growing because
And
they
that's
were
that
capitalizing expenses.
interpretive crowd. They have this magnificent ability to say, show me where this violates the law.
Right.
And then the next two categories I'll cover together.
Okay.
And they're people who comply with the laws and regulations. But there is a higher law, and that's where ethics comes in. And I'll share with you an example. I was teaching at another university, and a student came up to me, because I think sometimes they believe I have exceptions to not telling the truth, but I don't, but they just want to know anyway. And he had gotten a job at an office supply store, and you don't need to know which one. And he was told, you'll get this much per hour, but you need to sell 3 warranties on computers and printers per week, and you'll get bonuses based on that.